Hello, welcome everyone. It is wonderful to see all of you here today. As additional folks join, we invite you to check in the chat. How are you today? How are you joining this call? And where are you calling in from? We'll give folks just a few more minutes to join before we dive in.
So just to add to Claire's welcome everyone. We're really excited about this first webinar of the year. Just as we're ready to get started, if you could just check in the chat with your name, with where you're dialing in from and how you are today, that would be really lovely. Thank you.
It's great to see a lot of familiar faces as well as new. We are thrilled to be back together in this monthly series to discuss well-being and leadership and the field of social change. Many of you know this is a continuation from last year and also the first session of this year. So Happy New Year if we haven't connected this year so far. Wonderful to see where you're calling in from. This series is leading us towards a summit that the Wellbeing Project is hosting. So I'd love, Aaron, if you'd like to share a little bit about that with the group as folks continue to join and check in.
Thanks, Claire. And so we're really excited to see everyone again. Happy New Year. And for us, this is a really exciting beginning to the year. We're building towards an event that we're hosting in June, from June 1st to June 3rd in Bilbao. We've been developing this now for about 4 years, and really this is a co-creation built with our partners and co-creators like the Skoll Foundation and others. And the purpose of this is really to bring together the community of us that are really working to advance a culture of inner well-being in the field of social change. So this will be the first big global gathering that happens at that intersection of both well-being and social change. We're excited that this is happening in partnership with the local and regional government. So the city of Bilbao and also the regional government of Biscay, who are also opening up a whole range of different spaces for us across the city. We have over 60 speakers, over 70 different countries that are confirmed. And probably one of the most exciting things for us is that we've really put art and culture at the heart of this gathering. So it's going to be the lens through which we explore, the language through which we experience and understand. And so the event will include a number of remarkable artists, arts institutions, and much, much more. So you'll get a bit of a sense of the kinds of topics from this webinar. There's also more to come, but we'll be covering everything from individual well-being to intergenerational trauma, to organizational well-being and other things. And so it really is meant as a place of meeting for all of us that are thinking about this subject. We're excited about it. And Alice will be sharing a bit more in the chat. And so we hope that this is something that you might follow. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Claire.
Thanks, Aaron and Alice, for the information. We are excited to dive into today's conversation and welcome back the dynamic duo, Parker Palmer and Sharon Salzberg, as well as a special guest today, David Simas with the Obama Foundation. David's bringing a rich history and political experience, as well as a through line of well-being and how we can integrate this with our lives and work. So thrilled to pass it to you, Sharon and Parker, to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Claire. I'm just delighted to be back with the band here as we launch our 2022 tour. Maybe we'll call it When Hell Freezes Over, just like the Eagles did. I don't know, yet to be decided. And to have David Simas sit in with us today is just a real treat. When David and Sharon and the Wellbeing folks and Aaron and I met a couple of weeks ago, I got to telling a little story about a recent conversation I had in a small group with Ambassador Andrew Young. Some of you will know the name Andy Young from the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century in this country. For others, he was a close companion with Martin Luther King Jr., often popped up in the White House with King when Lyndon Johnson was president. Andy Young went on to become Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the UN and then mayor of Atlanta. He's now approaching, he's very close to his 90th birthday. And it was a profound privilege to listen to him reflect on the civil rights movement of the last century and its ongoing forms with young activists. And he said, one of the points I want to make is that Martin Luther King Jr. spent a lot of time with us. He called his group back in the day, this ragtag group of young people who had no reason to believe they could make a difference. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, spent a lot of time with us talking about life and death, and especially death. There was a kind of motto among us that if death were your greatest fear, you could never experience zest for life. And if you didn't experience zest for life, you wouldn't have that deep well of inner resourcefulness needed to engage in really challenging forms of social change, specifically work for racial justice. I questioned him about this, learned a great deal, and both Sharon and David resonated with this notion that we have to take seriously the deepest reaches of formation for activism if we want to have full access to the well that engages us in zest for life and in risk-taking activity. So I'm going to ask Claire to put up a poem by Mary Oliver to start with this morning called When Death Comes. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut. When death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades. I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. That poem goes places that I find very, very important. Not only about embracing death with curiosity, but about how in this life, the awareness of death can help us practice profound respect and regard for each and every human soul, the thing that's so missing in our political discourse so often. Each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, each name a comfortable music in the mouth, each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. That line in particular has come home strongly to me during the 2 years of the pandemic and the renewed reckoning in our country with racial justice. So We wanted to start there today to say this conversation is open to the depths. And with that, I want to turn to David and welcome you again to this conversation. I know these are depths that you swim in. I know you've had a long years of experience in politics and social change. And I'm assuming that you were animated from the beginning, David, by this kind of regard for human beings and this kind of care for the human condition. After now, what, 30 plus years of hard experience in hard politics, I'd love to hear you reflect on how that journey has and has not changed you and what it is you've wrestled with inwardly along the way.
Parker, I am so deeply grateful for you and for the way you began this session, especially with a poem that you selected. And as I said when we spoke a few weeks ago, to be joined with Sharon, who is a teacher and has been a teacher to me for some years, is just a real joy. And to everyone else in the community and to the folks who brought this together, thank you for what you do and how you do it. Parker, let me begin by just saying that I am the product of two Portuguese immigrants with a fourth grade education, who are two of the most amazing people that I have ever met in my life. In Portuguese, my father would always say to me all the time as a little boy, and even to this day, and I'm now 52 years of age, the Portuguese word is respeito, respect. That was essentially the guiding principle. And the way he would talk about respeito in the context was always for yourself and then for all of the people around you as the guiding principle. And what was really inherent in this, and I will bring it back to the poem, at least in terms of my reflection, was that his vision and the way he would bring up respeito, respect, was as a constant series of actions and choices. So there was a constant kind of bounding into this moment with a reflection that was both inward and then the ramifications outwards. So that's the first thing that I want to lay out there. The second thing that goes to my mother, one of my very first memories, and again, fourth grade education, she was probably, when this happened, what I'm going to mention, 23 years of age. And so she was in a factory in my hometown in Taunton, Massachusetts, making forks and spoons and knives. And the machine malfunctioned. And within a second, my mother had lost fingers on her hand. And when you're an immigrant who doesn't speak the language, who has a fourth grade education, all you have are your hands and your back. It's all you have. And I remember so vividly that in that suffering and in the physical pain that my mom felt, I remember a couple of things. One, even in the depth of what she was feeling, the love that she would show to me, as if that never happened. This resource of, okay, this is horrible. What can I make you for breakfast, my son? Feed you. So that was her. The other thing that I saw was my aunts, my uncles, my neighbors, the parish priest at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, her co-workers, an entire community of mostly other Portuguese immigrants on a weekly and a nightly basis would be there to lift her up and to lift up my dad and to lift me up. And so in this moment of pain and suffering, I saw her inner joy and strength and love and power. And then I saw just the way the community enveloped all of us. And so in those two things from my parents, my dad's exhortations in terms of what is expected as a human, and then in my mom's modeling and in the community's modeling of what is expected of all of us in community, I think, Parker, that has served as the backdrop for a career, a life engaged in community service in government and in politics. And the final thing that I will say in response to your question, to kind of tie it all back together, sometimes I will close my eyes like I'm doing now and imagine walking through the doors to the West Wing of the White House. And at the door, if the president is in the Oval Office, there is a Marine at attention. And as you, a person, a citizen, any human being walks to the door, the Marine, at that moment, the representative of the United States of America, will in a crisp and sharp fashion open the door for you as you enter the people's house. Every single day that I have the honor to walk through that door and to see that Marine, on the way in the morning and the way out at night, I repeated the same mantra to myself that was taught to me by another mentor and teacher who was the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a man named Deval Patrick. And Deval's mantra that he taught me was essentially the following phrase: remember who you are and what you represent. And every single day in the morning and at night, I would repeat that. And every single time I said that, the images and visions of my parents would come into my mind, of my teachers, of my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, my wife, my children. It was a reminder of service, but also a warning. You know, when you think of wonderful old literature of even in conquest, Roman generals would have the memento mori, that all glory is fleeting. That was a reminder that, yeah, you're walking in to this building with the title of Assistant to the President of the United States of America. You're here to serve. Ego, vanity, pride, jealousy, ambition are always there. They would visit constantly. In those moments, you know, that's where the reminder would be the most necessary and at times the most well received. So, thank you for that question, Parker.
Thank you, David. So it's remember who you are, whose you are, and that life is precious and brief. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fantastic to hear that story, because, you know, the kind of sad thing is that in terms of looking at people in public life from the outside, one doesn't always get the impression of that kind of wholeness of being, you know, and so much of it seems to be presentation, sometimes toward a good end. It's very transactional. I need to get this done, and so I will present myself and the needs of the people. But there's so many times in just being a citizen, I think, doesn't anybody care about us? You know, like, where we figure in, and so it's beautiful to hear about those values. And I have to say, the first time I ever heard you speak, that's what struck me. You know, when I was a guest of the Massachusetts delegation to actually both conventions that nominated Barack Obama. And the second one, I was staying in the same hotel as the delegation. And so I came to realize that every morning at breakfast, they would have speakers come in for breakfast. And in a lot of cases, it was people who were then going to speak on the main stage, and they were kind of practicing, you know, with us and maybe many other people. And you're from Massachusetts, as am I currently. And I was so taken with who you seem to be. And my phrase was, he has an inner life. You know, it's not just this kind of presentation for it's coming from somewhere inside, and it's unified. It's not like a struggle. It didn't seem to be. So I sent my friend off to meet you, and I said, he has an inner life. Plus, I said, he's wearing a mala. He's wearing beads. And our friend now, Tom, said, he's a Portuguese kid. He's wearing a rosary. He's not wearing a mala. You know, I said, he is wearing a mala. And that was the beginning of finding out, actually, you did have a meditation practice. So I'm curious about when that came about for you, that meditation was a part of your journey.
Yeah. Sharon, thank you for that memory. I remember that breakfast. I remember speaking in front of the Massachusetts delegation, and I remember being terrified because it was one of the first times that I had, in that capacity, spoken in front of Deval Patrick. And so it was this kind of weird, not that the student becomes the teacher, but that the student is in a very different environment. And so there's I don't want to mess up. And there's a whole bunch of stuff going through. So after it was done, he looked at me and was like, not bad, which was great. In terms of practice, I loved, as a little boy, the Catholic Mass for me was one of the most beautiful series of rituals and moments. The standing, the kneeling, the pausing with the bells, the procession up to communion, the leaving the church, even in Sharon, in moments, to this day, even though they're the most sad experiences, a funeral mass. In some ways, I was steeped in a form of meditation that, even though I didn't realize what it was at the time, it's something that I felt. A formal practice for me began when President Obama asked me to leave the White House and to become his director of opinion research for the re-elect. And what that entailed was essentially overseeing a team of people who on a nightly basis would receive 5,000 data points from different interviews, focus groups, polls, streams of data, synthesize that into a series of messages that were consistent with a series of values and themes, and then send them out, all for the purpose of 270 electoral votes. I had never done anything like that in my life. And so when I said to both he and to David Axelrod, I'm like, I've not done this. And they both literally said, well, you'll figure it out. I'm like, oh, good. And so deep pressure and a sense of not just an imposter syndrome, but an Olympic imposter syndrome. Sharon, I heard your old friend John Kabat-Zinn being interviewed, and I've never heard of John. I've never sat with my breath at all, and it was like this moment of despair. And I'm like, well, let me give this a try. And week after week, day after day, it gave me, the way I describe it is it created a space for reflection and not reaction. And that space for me was what I needed in those moments of complete uncertainty of what I was facing. I mean, I figured it out completely and I made a ton of mistakes, but that's where the practice really began for me. And then you, when I was first introduced to metta, became so essential because one of the things that I had to do, both on that campaign, but then in Washington. So one of the things during the campaign and then after is I would listen to focus groups. And the purpose of the focus group wasn't necessarily to hear if people were Democrats or Republicans, whatever the case may be, but was to grab the essence of whatever people were saying and then go back to the White House and to convey that to my colleagues. You can imagine some of the horrendous things you would hear. And immediately, the judgment about that person would pop up, right? Well, I got to tell you, at that moment, loving kindness, when the anger and the frustration would arise, and you would hear this human being expressing something that to you was so fundamentally wrong. Like, my job is not to cast judgment on this man or woman. My job is to hear them, to try to understand as much as I can from their perspective why they are saying what they are saying. And then my job is to go back to convey that with justice and dignity to the President of the United States of America. And night after night after night, when I would come back, and I mean, Sharon, you sit there and you're across from him, and he is a kind and generous human being. But to be able to say to another human being, look, here's what I heard about why these group of people despise you. And to do that in a way that doesn't minimize what they're saying or just present it. The practice and all forms of the different ways to practice were so essential for me. So thank you for that teaching.
Well, thank you for bringing it to life. You know, it's funny, this morning, I was thinking about you in focus groups. It just popped into my mind. And but I didn't obviously loving kindness would be so crucial. You know, the place I was really pondering was like hearing things you didn't want to hear, you know, like bad news, so to speak. Because I remember a few times going to see you in the White House in 2016, when, of course, there was a major, very impactful election coming up in the US. And I was sort of like, tell me good news, you know, but you didn't have very good news often. And nobody knew exactly, but you were kind of my key to, like, it's not looking that great, you know, from what you're hearing. And I thought that's a lot to keep on one's work and to be wholehearted and passionate about what you're doing. And yet to realize it may not go that well this time. You know, what's the longer term vision for my work, and what needs to be emphasized? And it's a lot. And I think in some ways it comes back to your dad saying respect, you know, respect for yourself and respect for everybody you're encountering.
Yeah, there's and it's part of what I try to do along with the team when we talk about leadership, where there are notions of leadership which are very autocratic, they're very top down, they're very directive. And sometimes, look, when consensus is not at hand and decisions need to be made, then someone or a group of people needs to decide, and people are going to be unhappy, right? That is required. And then there is accountability and all of that. But in some ways, not in some ways, we disaggregate a leadership curriculum into 3 component parts. And the first part is the leadership of self. Going back to respect, that until you are in a place that even if you believe, based upon either your experiences or what you have learned, that you are completely right in a certain course, until you are in a place to begin to truly question those assumptions and then open to the perspective and the reality that you do not have a monopoly on all truth. You don't. And then how that feels and how you then position that against prestige. How will my colleagues think about me? What does this do to my perception of power? How does this factor into my plan in terms of where I'm going to be in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? If I show openness to my quote unquote enemy or my opponent, even though in this instance he or she is right, what does that do to the perception of my supporters and the dynamic that has been created, right? All of that occurs in the blink of an eye. And again, back to the space between reflection and reaction. In that moment, my God, there's so much that can occur in terms of your preparation and in playing with the moment, which is why we begin with getting your stuff together. What are your biases? And I don't just mean, how, anger or prejudices that you have against a people or a group of people, but like, what do you prefer? What are those things that, what are your blind spots? What are your triggers? What sets you off? Who is that person that if you're going into a meeting with them, even before you walk into the meeting, you're saying, oh my goodness, they get on my last nerve. It's, for me, I've got an uncle and I love him dearly. But every Thanksgiving on my drive to the house, I say to myself, David, this time it's going to be different. And then I see him. Right? And so that, that leadership of self is so foundational. And I'm so blessed that at least with hopefully the last 2 elected officials that I ever worked for in my life, Deval Patrick and Barack Obama, both of them had a core where they would essentially, I think one of the lines was, let's begin with the right thing to do and work backwards from that, right? Like, that just sets the tone for an entire discussion. So, David,
I definitely don't want you to give up your day job, but you could hang up a shingle and teach this stuff, just freelance. You're really very good at it. But I want to focus on the teaching that you're already doing in the context of the Obama Foundation, and turn the conversation towards the years of experience that it's taken you and most of us to learn some of these things, toward this wonderful, promising young generation of activists that a lot of us are working with in different ways, and you're working with them in some very focused and interesting ways at the foundation. So I'm very interested to know, what do you see in them in terms of possibilities that maybe, weren't there in my generation or your generation, in terms of things that you would like to help them understand that their own formation hasn't taken them to as yet? Just that whole range of questions of what you're looking at and working with as you have the privilege, really, of interacting with young activists who really want to make this a better world.
I'm so glad that you used the word privilege in that sense, because it is a complete privilege. My my dad said, he borrowed it from someone, I'm sure, but essentially life is divided into thirds. The first third, you're kind of figuring out what you want to be. The second third, you're doing it. And then the final third, which he told me I have now entered. I don't know what that means, but it's like now you have a responsibility to step back and to be a resource for everybody going through those first 2/3. And it's and to get to do that for a living is pretty cool. So
FYI, there's a fourth third, just so you know.
I can't wait to hear the definition of that so I can go back to them. So first, this generation of leader, organizer, activist, however you want to define them, has all of the world's information at their fingertips in a way that no previous human generation has ever had. Parker, that is just when you stop and reflect on that, it leads to a sense of possibility. And in some ways, no bounds and no parameters. That's super important. And so from an information perspective, essentially, the world is there and it's super small. And so there are a few boundaries. So that's on one side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger, then, it's for every positive, there's a not so, but there's a challenge. Focus. Because you can do just about anything or all, you can't. And so there's a tempering to it. That's both in terms of vision and what you want to focus on, but then goes back to you and how to govern and how to regulate yourself so that you don't completely burn out. So there's the first piece. The second piece that also in some ways flows from technology is President Obama reflects on this. When he was a young organizer, making mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake, he didn't have people to turn to who were going through the journey as he was, or who had been on the journey 5, 10, 15 years before. So he was reinventing the wheel constantly. In some ways, that's a good thing to just learn from trial and error. But the second thing that I love to see from this group of organizers and leaders and activists is the connection buy-in between people, not just in the United States, but globally. And so it's there and it's diffuse. And so you see people learning from each other in this wonderful kind of web of connectivity, right? So that's on the opportunity. On the challenge part of it, two things. One, you can quickly move from signal to noise in terms of the discernment of what is relevant to the experience that you're going through. That's first. And the two, the instinct to tribe and othering becomes super powerful. Which now leads me into the third reflection on this that I think we're engaging with is when you have all of the world's information at your disposal, when you are connected with a like group of individuals who are going through things, sometimes there can be a rigidity around my way is clearly the best way, and anyone who doesn't agree with me is venal or evil or ignorant or whatever the case may be. Right? And so there are these three buckets of things that we are seeing that then inform our approach to the way we work with them. And so those are the things that I'm seeing today in the leaders. Final thing I'll say is just on well-being for them. In our leadership development programs, a question that comes up more frequently than almost any other is, how do I find balance? I am burning out. I am working so hard, but yet I'm not seeing, or I am there is a burnout that then can turn into cynicism and can turn into a variety of other negative consequences. And so working with the leaders in terms of giving them some guidelines on how to achieve some level of balance in their lives, and convincing them in a way that Michelle Obama is actually the best I have ever seen about this, to say, look, you want to be very practical. If you want to achieve the things that you want to achieve in terms of justice or whatever the case may be, and you're only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, you're going to fail, period. So from a very functional, tactical perspective, you are a human being, and here are your constraints. You are not a superhuman. And so layering that into the discussion is something that's important for us.
Now I want a recording of Michelle Obama saying, if you're only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, you're going to fail. And I'll just play it. I think that would be really useful. I'm really struck, David, partly because I had just been writing myself about what I suspected were kind of generational differences in ways we get out of balance, because we're all seeking balance in a different way. And it seemed to me that a lot of younger people I know, and granted they are not necessarily leaders in a social change movement, are incredibly cynical and despairing, and things like climate change really have them almost in this sort of nihilistic posture, like nothing to be done, it's too late. So I'm really struck by the fact that you have people who have aspiration, they have a vision, they really believe actions can make a difference, that they can make a difference. And in a way, I'm not surprised that all this other stuff may come with it, because it's hard gotten these days, just to have that sort of vision, that sense of possibility. And so I'm wondering if you could say something about like the average age of the fellows and the kind of work that they're doing.
Yeah. So our Obama leaders and our Obama scholars, those are the two primary leadership development programs. For the leaders, average age is 30, 31. Sharon, they are on, we pick a cohort from Africa. We pick a cohort from Asia. We pick a cohort from Europe. Next year, we're going to pick cohorts from the United States, the year after from Latin America. So by the year 2026, on an annual basis, there will be between 300 and 400 Obama leaders selected each year. These are young men and women who are doing work in 3 broad sectors. Some are in business, some are in the not-for-profit sector, and some are in government. And the notion there is that change comes in a variety of different ways. And if you are just focusing on another, you are missing the impact of the other 2 or 3. When we select them, and here's the really hard part, because we're not just picking someone because they do climate work or any kind of justice work or education work, what are the core values in leadership style that individual brings that to us says, okay, we're ready to go on a journey with you because you espouse and embody these sets of values. Not that you are perfect, but essentially from an inclusivity perspective, not just to make sure that as you lead, there are a multiplicity of differences at the table, but also difference of opinion, especially difference of opinion. How do you make sure that that's factored? So we look for people that have a certain way, and then in terms of the training, how do we constantly reinforce the values as part of the training? So it becomes a less tactical, here's how you do A, B, C, or D. You'll figure that out, and we will provide you with resources and people to help you figure out the tactics. But at the end of the day, before you make that decision, what is informing you? When you stand on the stage and there are people cheering or booing, if they are cheering, you're going to love because you are a human being. The ego, the vanity, the pride is going to be there. It's going to visit. When it does, what are you prepared to meet it? A sense of humility, a sense of compassion, a sense of mission. Don't get all upset with yourself because it feels good. But when it does, what do you do, right? Those are the type of intangibles in some ways that then help us to engage with people. Let me give you some without naming names. You met one of them, a young woman who does work in Rwanda, who literally the entire idea is, can you go into villages, in this case Rwanda, and I think Uganda, and rather than telling people what you think they need, how can you model a style of leadership where the community or the village itself is saying, here is what we need, and now you are in service to them. And so even though they may decide to build a bridge over a ravine that allows the product to go to market more frequently, that's a good outcome. But here's the better outcome. The woman who previously didn't have a voice in the village, because of the process that you established, has a voice. And what does that mean to her children and to the other children who are watching a woman in a very different light, and to the husband who, for whatever reason, created the space to say, in this context, right? That's the type of leadership. That's one example. Another example is we have a leader who works with people on serving life prisons in California. And he came up with a model where essentially when they are released in their 50s and 60s, he surrounds them with all kinds of resources, because freedom isn't, in that instance, simply being out of the state penitentiary. Freedom is being surrounded with a group of people who, at the moment of fear, in a moment of tension, are there not to direct, but to be a resource and to be a guide, right? So imagine the President and Mrs. Obama's vision is, if we go out 50 years and we have spent those 50 years on an annual basis creating a network of individuals around the planet who are informed by these values, serving in a multiplicity of ways, can you imagine what that does, not just to their countries, but essentially to the human condition and to culture and to society? And so that's the vision.
David, it's a very exciting vision and a very encouraging vision, and it's so good to get more granular about it for me, to learn these details. It strikes me that a lot of the things leaders need inwardly, tell me if you think I'm wrong, are very hard to come by all by yourself. You need people close in who can do something that a lot of leaders don't have, because the higher you rise in leadership, the fewer the people are who are willing to tell you the truth, who are willing to check and correct you. And so there's this kind of down the rabbit hole thing that happens with a lot of leaders, where all they're getting is the good stuff because somebody wants something from them. Now, in the Obama Fellowship, you have a built-in community that helps people, that offers correctives, that offers mid-course alterations, that challenges certain assumptions and practices and ways of being. What can you do to help leaders carry on that more intimate form of communal challenge as they move deeper and sometimes higher in leadership and become more isolated?
So one of the things that we say, and we're developing this, and so it's a work in progress, but what are your responsibilities as part of the network? what are your responsibilities, both for the next group of people that are coming in the next cohort, but also to your peers or anyone else in the network? Can you serve in some way as a board of advisors, as a board of trustees for individuals? Imagine if, you know, someone graduates from high school or graduates from college. In retrospect, one of the things that would have been most valuable for me is if I'd had 2 or 3 people who had been down the path before to say, you know what, David, I know where you're coming from, but here are some of the things that I think you're going to run into that you're not seeing yet, right? And so the requirement from a normative perspective that if you are part of this community, here is what you are expected to do, both to the next generation, but to your peers. What you said, Parker, about, you know, essentially the yes men and the yes women, look, I've seen it and I have been guilty of it. It's really hard, you know, to go to someone who is your superior and say, I think you're wrong. And here's why, right? There are ways to do it, and that's something that is teachable. And then you kind of play with it. And more often than not, the person on the receiving end of that is open to that because, oh, okay, who is this person? And how have they, right? And so there is a magic to it and an importance to it that we are beginning to embed into our, let me give you an example. One of our leaders, without mentioning the country, is about to assume a position of authority in a transitional government after an anti-democratic action was taken. And the person's questions are right. Do I trust? What are my parameters? What are my red lines? If I see that things are going askew, have I been clear about I will go this far and no further? And so in that instance, our responsibility as an organization was not to tell him what to do, but to surround him literally, Parker, with a group of advisors who are removed from that moment, but have enough tangible experience in trust where they can say, here is what we think you should look for. But understanding, as some of our leaders in Myanmar, as an LGBT activist we have in Belarus, I do office hours with many of these young men and women, multiple days a week. And the courage, hearkening back to the poem that you began this with, I have no conception, because I have never been down that path, of making a choice about leadership of my community or my country that literally could end up in a loss of freedom or a loss of life. The arrogance that I would have to show or someone else to say, oh, this is what you need to do, right? But the opening to others throughout the world who are going through it or have gone through it, right? That's where we can, I think, have a real impact. And the final thing I will say is the hope that I have when I see these young men and women and talk to them on a daily basis, notwithstanding all of the stuff that all of us read about, you know, is really just a tremendous inspiration. So.
Thank you, David.
Really, thank you. That was really inspiring. And I'm back to reflecting on the poem myself and Parker's really wonderful description of Martin Luther King Jr. bringing up that reflection on death, you know, and how some of the people you're describing, you know, the courage and the audacity to go out there, a country like Myanmar, you know, and and they've confronted that in some way, I imagine, you know, and that possibility, and even without perhaps a direct reflection on change and death, there is something that is so aligned with what is most important in life that it's really incredible. I was also thinking, I recently spoke to like an acquaintance of mine who's maybe he's in his late 50s, early 60s, made quite a lot of money and doing whatever he was doing, not like a gazillionaire, but he said, I never really have to work again, you know, and was devoting this third of his life or quarter to service and mentoring people and meditation and philosophical inquiry and all kinds of things. And then he got a job offer to be a CEO of some company, making a huge amount of money and being phenomenally busy, you know, and tied up and responsible and all of that. And he was really torn. And I don't think he's going to do it, but he was tempted, you know. And then he said to me, my wife, whom I've never met her, he said, my wife really thinks I should do it. She said, I don't want to think of you on your deathbed regretting that you didn't take that job. And I said to him, I don't think that's the common regret on one's deathbed. I don't think that's where most people go, you know, if they're filled with regret. It's more likely like I didn't pay enough attention to my family, or, you know, I didn't remind that person how much I love them or thank them or whatever. I don't think most of us end up, you know, thinking, God, that job, you know, like it would have been so much money. So it's almost like the underlying thread, even if it's hidden. You know, life is short, life is precious. What am I going to do? You know, what might I do, even if I don't see the results this decade? Where do I put my energy? What's most important? And so I think I'll end this conversation where Parker began it, which is just the efficacy of that reflection. And we're going to do a little bit of practice for a few minutes and then open up to questions. I've been reading the chat and some of the really wonderful questions that have been coming in. So why don't we sit comfortably? Just be at ease. You can close your eyes or not, however you wish. You can start by listening to sound, which may be the sound of my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside, allowing our experience to come and go. And bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. Feel space touching you. Remember, space is already touching us. It's always touching us. We just need to feel it. And bring your attention to the feeling of your breath, just the normal, natural breath, wherever it's clearest for you or strongest for you. Maybe that's the nostrils, the chest, or the abdomen. Find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. One of my meditation teachers used to say to us, be with each breath as though it were your first breath and as though it were your last breath. There's nothing to wait for or put off. That much immediacy, that much presence, and that much letting go. Just one breath. And then the next. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the session.
Thank you, Sharon. And as you said, there were a number of wonderful questions that came in. Thank you, everyone, for sharing in the chat. And so Claire and I have been going through those, and we'll just dance a little bit between the two of us to reflect some of those questions back to this wonderful trio. I think one question that sort of got left up in the air, and someone shared this back in, was Curiosity Parker about what that fourth third was. And I think that might be of service to David as well, if he's to take it back to his dad.
Well, I'm glad to elaborate on that, but at my age, elaboration shouldn't go on too long, although it's tempted always to do so. So I will, in a little while here, not like minutes, but days, I'll turn 83. And as I reflect on age, I said to a friend the other day, and this is my definition of the fourth third, he said, so what are you going to try next? And I said, well, it feels to me like I have nothing left to prove. And if I do, I don't have time to prove it. So that combination of proclamations opens the door to a brand new kind of space where I'm just free as a bird. And I'm doing things that I haven't done before. I'm experimenting in many, many ways. feeling utterly free about it. Whether I fly or fall doesn't really matter much in the great scheme of things. And so that's my fourth third. It's kind of like the door at the back of the closet into Narnia. And I'm really glad that I walked through it. And of course, I'm always glad for Sharon teaching me to breathe. That if I ever have to write an endorsement for Sharon, I'll just say she taught me to breathe.
And it's really good to know that there's a door into Narnia for all of us. So that's a really good takeaway as well. Claire, I'll pass it back to you.
Sure. Very curious, your reflections, given this is a community of leaders in social change, driving social justice, and it can be a challenging space to work in over time. The question is, how can we as leaders continue to stay motivated, keep the vision, and encourage our teams to fight the good fight, regardless of setbacks or challenges that come across our paths?
At least for me, the best for a team's perspective, but also I think for yourself, is to take a very broad view and a long view of the journey that you're engaged in. And one of the challenges is obviously the hopes are so high, the aspirations are so great, the focus is so impactful, that individuals and teams don't sometimes appreciate the steps that you have taken to make the improvement that then necessitate for you to hand the baton off to someone else who then will continue the march to do that. And so that the long view, I think, is essential, because one thing that I've been reflecting on, certainly in terms of notions of the concept and the practice of democracy, is that when you are dealing with massive populations of people who don't all agree, the necessity sometimes for ideas and for change to marinate, for it to become standard, for people to alter and to fix and to accept. Because if you don't create that space in this context, then the aversion to change, the backlash, the reaction can often be stronger than the impulse for benefit. And so for any leader, for anybody to think about what they're engaged in, it's both to take the long view, but also to understand the dynamic. Once you accept that, not everybody agrees with you, and what backlash and resistance looks like, and therefore what persuasion looks like, rather than dictation, even if you are 100% correct in your belief or your value system.
Yeah, I'm one way I've thought about that for myself, David, and I wonder what you think, is that you really have to hold a lot of paradoxes to do this work well. A classic paradox for me arises when somebody says, this is all about the fierce urgency of now. And my response over the years, I've learned eventually to say, yes, it is. And you have to remember that that sentiment, that feeling, that truth arose out of a 12, 13 generation struggle for justice, where people with less than half a degree of freedom did what they could within that half degree and kept passing it on to the next and the next and the next generation. So people like Andy Young are very clear that they build on many generations of ancestral action and very little ancestral freedom to ask for, to demand more.
Yeah, that's so, it's so right, Parker. And an example that President Obama gives frequently is that it took 20 plus years, if not 30 years, from Brown v. Board of Education to when schools in parts of the North, when you think about busing, began to be desegregated. And so it's the Supreme Court decision is a necessary, in some ways, first step. And then the work of change usually is not a law. It goes deeper than that. And that's where that paradox comes in.
Sharon, did you want to jump in as well?
Not yet. I'm reflecting about another question. I'm going to see if you ask it.
Oh, this feels like I've just and Claire have just entered into a version of like Wheel of Fortune or something like that. Will we choose the right question?
Will you choose it? I'm waiting to see. Well, I have a moment at the end where I can always make up for that lapse if it happens.
Maybe just because David started out with talking about his roots in Portugal and his parents, maybe we can ask a question that came from Portugal. So I'm just going to read this out. This is a little bit longer, so please just bear with us. So this is a question from an advisor to a mayor of a city in Portugal. So what he's seeing is society, citizens, perhaps with the contribution of social networks, are only looking for answers to their own problem without thinking about the community to which they belong. That is why it is so difficult to take measures for the well-being of the city, the country, and for Europe. So if it's possible for us to have an answer for this for you, David, how can politicians and policymakers act to turn the frustration of millions of people into hope? Not a small question.
No, not a small question at all, and not unique to Portugal. Before we began this discussion, we were, Parker, Sharon, and I were talking about Tocqueville's reflections on the American Republic in the 1830s. And one thing that he constantly referenced was the vibrancy of local engagement. The fact that in a place that the entire idea is premised upon self-governance, I, as a citizen, have power and responsibility to govern in those things that are collective, and I will, deal with the individual. One of the interesting things about this moment politically is the more things become nationalized and the more power becomes aggregated and centralized, even in a state level or even within a city. And even when you provide quote unquote benefits, the connection of citizenship begins to fray. You default into a consumptive mode. I am receiving this in a transactional view of my citizenship. I pay taxes, therefore I get X. You're a consumer rather than in the broadest sense of, I am a member of a community with responsibilities to that community. And so one way perhaps where mayors have an ability to do this that governors and prime ministers and presidents don't is a true devolution of authority and power. And I don't know what form that takes, but literally, imagine a scenario. In Ireland just did a wonderful experiment with citizen assemblies, where essentially you get people to make decisions about things that affect them in their community without the necessity of the intermediary of the elected official. There are certain things that are required for the elected official in government, not everything. that's one perspective that I just think bears reflecting, that in some ways the centralization and the provision of taking care of a broader element of society may actually perversely run to the kind of the heart of a full view and expanse of citizenship, which then enables people to learn to engage with their neighbors, to mediate difference, to enter into a discussion with a generosity of spirit because I have to work with this person. That's the stuff of democracy. James Fallows wrote about this. I forget the essay, it was last year, around a consumptive view of democracy versus a creative view. What am I entitled to that I paid for, which is true, versus what can I create with you together? That goes to the heart of self-governance, right? It's like, at least from the United States' perspective, I will not speak to any other country. I'm going to sound hokey. Forgive me. We the people, literally from a structural and a governance perspective, is about each and every individual having self-governance responsibility. Not I voted, therefore my responsibility is done. And I'll, and when you don't do what I told you to do, I'm going to be really angry with you and shut down. I'm sorry that I can't be much more prescriptive in a recommendation to the very fine question, but there's a tension there that government leaders, I think, need to wrestle with in terms of their leadership.
And I would just add quickly, David, in the spirit of Tocqueville, who focused, as you said, on local voluntary associations and nonprofit organizations of various sorts, that it's really incumbent on us to ask, where in our local communities are people learning to be participants rather than consumers, participants rather than audience? My sense is that not enough of that, not nearly enough of that is going on in our schools. Not nearly enough of that is going on in our religious communities. And you subtract those from the equation, and the whole question of where people might learn the habit of participation, engagement, mutuality becomes hard to answer. It could happen in the family, but that's a horse of a different color in many regards. Minus the schools and religious communities, what are the, and civic associations, where are the voluntary associations that help people learn that habit of the heart?
Important questions for us to continue wrestling with together. I'm afraid we are coming to the end of our time. So Sharon, I'd love to come to you first and open space for you to speak to the question that resonated in the chat. There are many more that we haven't gotten to, and please know that we're capturing those and we'll fold those into our next steps here. But over to you, Sharon, and then Parker for some closing or in progress reflections. There's so much here to continue.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to respond to this, or I want to ask the question on behalf of the questioner, and then, put in my response and hear from others. I also just want to say how happy I am as having been a part of this conversation and bringing David and Parker together. Also, like Parker is so renowned in the field of education and so many ways, but when I first met him in person, I said, I loved your book, Healing the Heart of Democracy. And I wondered if that was a little bit odd, because probably very few people pick that particular book as compared to, the incredibly impactful and important works on education. But it is a very important book for me. And so I just love the idea of them discussing that. So this is the question. Social justice can be challenging to work in. It can be defeating to keep motivation and stay optimistic when there are frequent happenings around the country and world that feel like setbacks. Attacks based on race, new legislations introduced that discourage equity, etc. How can a leader continue to stay motivated, keep the vision, and encourage their team to fight the good fight when it sometimes feels like we're going backwards? And I think part of the reason I resonated with the question is because the version I am asked so much is, how can I stay mindful all day long? And how can I keep from like yelling at my kids ever again because of my mindfulness? How can I keep or maintain the level of concentration I got on that retreat? And my answer is, that's not going to happen. It's just not. You know, you're going to feel defeated. You're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to lose inspiration, and yet, you know, we learn the skill of starting over. We learn some resilience. We learn how to forgive ourselves in the important way we need to, so that we can move on, maybe lessons learned. And that's why it hit such a chord in me, because I don't know if my answer is discouraging to people, but it seems like revealing one's vulnerability and being honest about that is important.
So true. And, you know, there's the way I've heard President Obama answer this for leaders who have asked him that question. He's like, look, first, take the long view. Second, realize, yeah, it's a step back. And now you learn, you reposition, and you get prepared to take 2 steps forward. That's what you do. That's what we all do. You know, and so it's, you know, sometimes it's a hard message to deliver, but Sharon, similar to what you just said, I think it has the virtue of truth, which is a good place to begin.
Parker, any closing thoughts from you as we wrap the session?
Well, too many to fit the time, but I'll try to pick just a couple. So first of all, David, I want to say how impactful it is for me, and I suspect a lot of other people on this call, to meet someone and hear from someone at this depth and who has had such extensive experience in the really tough world of politics over the last 30, 35 years in American life, and who has come out with the kind of clarity and encouragement and inspiration that you bring to me. I just find the modeling, the exemplar, the witness really, really important and really, really needful in our day, when so many simply don't trust people who get anywhere near the kinds of offices and positions that you've occupied. I want to thank you for that. I know you will say, you have already said, I messed up, I made mistakes, I did this and that. But there's a wholeness of who you are today that I think reminds me that wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means embracing your brokenness as a legitimate and often important part of your life, as long as you can keep living your life and achieving that the gift that we call wholeness, which is really self-embrace, being able to say, yeah, I'm all of the above. That's hugely important and hugely refreshing. I also want to say that your work models for me something I've believed for a long time, and that is the absolutely critical role of intergenerational work on the social change front. At 83, I have so much to learn from the younger people with whom I work. And, you know, they tell me every now and then that they get some gifts from me as well, that come from experience in a different time under different pressures with different dynamics, but still at the level of soul, seem very similar when we get there together. It's a joy to get there together. And finally, I'll just say, everybody gets and deserves a fourth third. I don't care how old you are, just go into your closet, find the door, and walk into Narnia. In my recent book on aging, I said something about old is just another word for nothing left to lose. So get out there and take some creative risks on behalf of the common good. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you, David, so much. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Wellbeing folk, and thanks to all of you on the call.
Beautifully said, Parker. Thank you so much to you and Sharon and David for today's discussion. We're hopeful to be back with this community in another month as we continue to journey towards the global summit that Aaron shared at the beginning of our call today. And with that, just so much gratitude for all of you to coming back together, continuing this space where we can reflect and connect in the midst of our days, whatever time it is where you're calling in from. And back over to you, Aaron.
I have to say, I'm looking forward to my fourth third right now. The idea of like wandering through a wardrobe into Narnia just sounds fantastic. I think we're all feeling deeply grateful. I'd just love to echo what Parker and Sharon and David, what you said, because it's just been a delight to listen to all three of you. Thank you for sharing with us through this time. We have another webinar coming up in March, which will be taking time with poetry and other forms of art to really deepen into the way that art helps us also explore paths of well-being and understanding self and relationship to community. So we'll be sharing out more information about that shortly. And then I'd love to just invite us as we come to a close today to turn on your cameras and video. And as you sign off, maybe just we'd love to all thank these wonderful three who've been so gracious in their sharings with us today. So maybe we could do that as we sign off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Obrigada.
Valeu, obrigadão.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.